What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another NFL Fantasy Football preview. We've got Dave Del Grande and Joe Marsh here, and we're going to talk about a few different draft strategies, the pros and cons to each one. Let's get right into it. Dave, I think you're the best one to start with here. I want to talk about going running back, running back, running back with your first three picks. I think out of us three, you're the most likely to do that. So why don't you tell us we're assuming a couple things here. One, it's PPR league. Two, you can start three running backs. So you have to start two running backs, you have to start three wide receivers, and you have to start a flex, which can be a tight end, a wide receiver, or a running back. So give me the pros and cons to going running back, running back, running back with your first three picks.
Well, the pro would be that I think most people would agree that there is a set number of elite running backs, and there's a set number of a somewhat small number of second-tier running backs. There are a lot of people who believe that the bigger those numbers are, the more you can wait to draft the position. I think those numbers are relatively small this year. I think there are three, arguably four, elite running backs, and then I would go down to maybe number 11 or 12, so in other words, another group of 8 or 9 for my second-tier running backs. I want two of those guys on my team. This would lead me to want to draft running back first and second. Now, come round 3, if it's my pick in round 3 and one of those 12 guys is still out there, then I'm going to take him then and then have gone running back. There are two reasons for that. Number one, like I said, I think there are only a small number of these elite or tier 2 guys, and I've got 3 of them. That's just leaving 9 for the other 11 teams combined. I'm going to have a huge advantage at running back, which I consider a key position, over every other team. And that's a big part of this, that when there is a finite number of these high-level guys, for everyone that I take means one fewer for the competition. So I think this would, I wouldn't recommend, going running back, unless, like I said, if there's still a guy on your tier 2 who's available. Like, for example, the last guy on my tier 2 is Reggie Bush. Now, I've seen him on, some leagues. He's not being drafted till, 4th round and maybe even 5th round in some leagues. Heck, some clowns rate Joey Bell ahead of him. But if I had 2 running backs in rounds 1 and 2, and Reggie Bush were still there in round 3, that's an example of when I would use the running back strategy.
Just so everyone knows, I'm the clown that Dave is referring to.
It was plural. I didn't say a clown. I said some clowns.
All right. So, Joe, I know that this isn't a strategy you're probably going to implement, but if you were to, what would be the reasons why? What do you like about it?
I think Dave kind of touched on it in 2 ways. One, that there are only a certain number of running backs, not only elite running backs, but guys who aren't really part of a split. You know what I'm saying? Guys like, in addition to our top 4 guys like Eddie Lacy, I'm assuming Monty Ball, a few others who are getting the rock most of the time. Some of the other situations can be tricky, where you have your goal line backs taking away touchdowns from your guys, or a Joique Bell-Reggie Bush combination where you don't know who the guy is, or maybe in New Orleans where it's very cloudy, where there's a few guys that will be getting the rock. It's a little dangerous to go with those guys when you don't really know, whereas Eddie Lacy, whether he plays well or doesn't, he's going to get the ball 20-plus times a game. And then the other thing Dave mentioned is dead on. Since there's only a certain amount of those guys, not only are you grabbing some, but you're depleting the pool for everyone else, so that some guys may miss the boat on that. If you grab, whatever, like the example he gave, 3 of the 12, there's not enough to go around. Some guys may be hung out to dry at running back.
Yeah, those are all fair points. I think what I like about it is that when you draft 3 running backs, you're protecting yourself against the inevitable injury at the position. So if your number 1 running back goes down, you still have 2 really good running backs. The problem is, I think that the strategy is still so popular. It has been for a very long time now, in fantasy football, to go very running back heavy early in the draft. So I find a lot of value in being contrarian and going the opposite way that the crowd is going and piling up on the receivers, taking all the points that you can get there. The wide receivers that go in the second and third round score on average about 3 more points than the running backs that go in the second and third rounds. So you're raising the ceiling of your team, the projected point total of your team every week, and that's typically the reason why I never go running back, running back, running back. The way you can avoid the injury risk later instead of going running back, running back, running back is to take the guys that are going to be in the good situations when someone else gets hurt. For instance, we've talked about in previous shows Fred Jackson, a guy like that, right? He's going to have value no matter what. But if C.J. Spiller gets hurt, most likely when C.J. Spiller gets hurt, because he's always banged up and he's a smallish back, you've got Fred Jackson that all of a sudden his value is going to go up. So I like looking at it that way, taking the guys that benefit from injuries. But how about we move on to another strategy then, the opposite of that. Maybe not to the extreme that I go, where I might take 4 wide receivers with my first 4 picks. Let's talk about the more common strategy of going just wide receiver with your first 2 picks. Joe, I think that's right up your alley, so why don't you kick us off with that?
Yeah, I like that a lot. It eliminates some of the risk of injury with a first-round running back. Now, guys like Peterson, Charles, in recent years have gotten injured, and that's your top guy. So that's really handicapping you right off the bat, losing your first-round pick. Now, it can happen to receivers like it did last year with Julio Jones, but it's a lot less common with receivers. The other thing is, and then also if you're going high on running backs, you also need to, if you go 3 running backs early, you need to give up picks later on to grab their handcuff, and that's taking up your roster spots. If you go three running backs early, grab all their handcuffs, that's 6 roster spots that you're now donating or dedicating to 3 positions. So I think that makes it a little tough as well. And then like you said, there's always running backs that you can grab off the waiver wire and plug in. Guys get hurt, someone steps up and goes in their place. Also, you and I talked about a strategy of just grabbing the backup guys. If someone doesn't grab their own handcuff, sucks for them. You grab their handcuff. If that guy gets hurt, he's up a creek, and you've got a running back that you can suddenly start.
Yeah, handcuffing is one of the things I want to get to. But before we get to that, Dave, why don't you talk about wide receiver?
Well, I don't want to sound like I'm a guy, and I agree with 100% of what you said there, Jeff, is that traditionally running backs go real early in drafts, and way too many of them get drafted early on. And I would agree with you. I'm not one of these guys who likes to draft the 8th best running back when the number 1 or the number 2 wide receiver or quarterback is available. But the way this year sets up, I just think it's a little bit different than most years, and the reason that I recommend going running back heavy first. I can't imagine going wide receiver first this year, because, like I said, in that scenario, you're almost doomed to have as your second starting running back a guy who, like Joe explained before, is a part-timer, a Fred Jackson guy. I can't imagine on opening week 1 of the NFL, week 1 of the fantasy season, throwing Fred Jackson out there as my starting running back, knowing that he's a part-time player. And that's the situation that you're going to be in when you go wide receiver heavy early on. I think there's a lot of great, elite level wide receivers. I agree that the way the game is going, wide receivers are starting to outscore running backs. But the problem is that I think there's a ton of wide receivers, way more wide receivers who are fantasy worthy than there are running backs that are fantasy worthy. The reason for that? Well, because you start 2 of them, whereas you only start 1 running back, and some teams start 3 of them. Heck, Denver's number 3 wideout last year, Decker ranked as the 10th or 11th best, most productive wide receiver in the game. So some of these number 2 and number 3 receivers, guys who maybe are, somewhere in the 30s on draft lists among wide receivers, these are going to be very high-scoring guys in the fantasy game, whereas very few of these running backs, unless they get, promoted because of an injury, very few of these guys who are, part-time backs, guys who are splitting carries, are going to end up, with that kind of ranking at the end of the season. So if you're out, the reason for drafting wide receiver is a very good chance that the two wide receivers you draft first and second are going to outscore the two running backs I draft first and second. I think there's a very, very good chance of that. But I would counter that by saying, you know what, the two wide receivers I draft in the fourth and fifth round are going to way outscore the two running backs you draft in the fourth and fifth round, and that's where I'm going to catch up and go ahead.
Yeah, unless things take a completely different turn than they have been in the past few years, that's just not going to be the case. I mean, I have run the numbers, and like I said, drafting wide receiver early, you get that 2 to 3 points to benefit your team on average per selection, and then as it gets later towards the draft in the fifth, sixth rounds, where I'm taking my running backs, everyone else is taking wide receivers. If you compare say it's the wide receiver 30 to the running back 30, which it's not. But for example, you're going to have right around the same points later in the draft. So it's worth looking at. Of course, things can change year to year. But again, last year, talking about the first couple rounds, there were only 3 running backs who scored more than 19 fantasy points per game. I think you can safely project 4 this year to score 19 or more per game. And so the problem is they're going in the first 4 picks. There's no way to get one of those guys unless you have one of the first 4 picks. So I don't have a problem at all with going running back there and not using the wide receiver strategy. In fact, I recommend to go running back there and then come around with a wide receiver. But anything past the first 4 picks, you either have to go Jimmy Graham or 2 wide receivers after that, in my opinion, because the first 8 wide receivers last year, the top 8 wide receivers all scored more than 19 points per game, whereas there was only 4 for running back. So anyway, that's the gist of it, is that I truly believe you gain more points by going wide receiver early. But Joe, hop in there.
I'm with you. It's a strategy you and I have talked about. We're both big on it. I'm with you 100%. Unless you have one of those really elite running backs, if you have a shot to get that, we talked about that in the draft strategy video. Mm-hmm. That those are the top 4. But then after that, I think you need to grab some wide receivers. I think there's just not enough points available from the next tier of running backs.
For sure. So another popular strategy this year, well, it was really popularized last year, is the late round quarterback, right? So the idea was that quarterbacks are so bunched together that it doesn't really matter which one you have. There's last year it was believed to be 3 quarterbacks of the first tier: Peyton Manning, Rodgers, Breeze, just like it is this year, unless you're me and you throw Foles in that first tier. But after that, the people believed it was bunched up. So it was essentially a game of chicken. Who can wait the longest to draft their quarterback? Because I don't care what the difference is between RG3 and Andrew Luck. To me, they're the same. That's essentially what everyone thought. And you all of a sudden, where typically you want to get your quarterback in the first 5 rounds, the earliest most people were taking them, if you're not getting one of the top 3 elite guys, was the 7th round. So that worked so well for people last year that it is becoming very popular this year, and you're seeing it to go to even further extremes where people are playing chicken till the 9th round, where you're seeing that next tier of quarterbacks go off. And Dave, I'm curious what you think about that. I know you're very high in Peyton this year and getting one of those elite quarterbacks early this year, but is there any validity to the strategy of the late round quarterback and just waiting as long as possible?
Absolutely. I think it's it fits a principle that we've talked about on other videos, and that is the tier drafting. I mean, like you said, I agree. Well, not necessarily with Foles being in tier 1, although I do like him. I do agree that tier 1 pretty clearly has Manning, Rodgers, and Breeze in it. And if you don't get one of those 3 guys, then my tier 2 has 7 or 8 guys in it. And so there's no reason for me to go out and draft my 4th ranked quarterback in round 3 or 4 when I can get basically the same guy in round 8 or round 9 as the last guy in my tier. And the way you explained it there, the more people that play this chicken game, the better it is for you, because you can wait even longer. especially if there's a guy in your tier 2 that you think you like that maybe nobody else does. And so you know that you can wait maybe even in round 9, round 10, and still get this guy. I would say that when you do draft that way, and it's like I said, if I don't get one of these top 3 quarterbacks, it's probably a strategy that I'm going to employ this year. When you do use that strategy, I do recommend that you draft 2 quarterbacks almost back to back, because you're taking a risk at your quarterback position. You're getting a guy, who obviously you might be the only one who likes him. So if you got the worst starting quarterback, it behooves you to have the best backup quarterback to give you options, at the quarterback position.
Joe has said a similar thing, but to me that completely nullifies the point. The point is to gain value by waiting on your quarterback. But if you just take another quarterback, that's essentially wasting a pick to me. I want to have confidence in that selection if I'm going to play the late round quarterback and end up with, say, a Colin Kaepernick or a Tony Romo, a guy that Joe likes. That guy can be my number 1 quarterback. But Joe, I know you side with Dave on this because you've mentioned the same thing before. So talk to us about this strategy.
Yeah, I think you and I used it pretty well last year in the FFPC. We waited. We let a lot of quarterbacks go off the board, and we still ended up with Matt Stafford and Robert Griffin. I believe that was 7th and 8th round, or 8th and 9th round that we came out with those guys. Stafford ended up being one of the top quarterbacks. Now, same thing this year. So if you mention those top 3, and then I'll throw in, Foles and Stafford, say all those guys are off the board. Who's the next quarterback? I'm not even 100% sure as it is. Is it Ryan, Romo, Rivers, Cam Newton, RG3, Andrew Luck? There's a lot of guys in that tier. I think, with a little luck, you could come out with probably the 5th best quarterback, and in the 9th round, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's actually a good point you made. RG3 would be the one guy that I would make sure I had a solid backup for. I know Dave's talked about that too before. That guy is such an injury risk that you do need a solid backup. So that's a good point there.
Let me jump in and add one thing to this discussion, and that is, if you've waited until round 8 to take your quarterback, this means that you have, on average, you have 3 running backs, you have 4 wide receivers, and you have a tight end. In other words, you've got your starting nucleus there, and you have a flex, and you have a backup at each of the running back and wide receiver position. So come round 9, your choice is, do I want to draft a second quarterback? You consider it kind of a wasted pick. Do I draft a second quarterback, which is my greatest position of need, or do I go out and draft a 4th running back, who's going to be my second backup, a 5th wide receiver, who's going to be my second backup, or a backup tight end, which I consider totally useless? I would argue that you're best off, what your greatest need is at that point is a second quarterback. So I wouldn't consider that a wasted pick.
To me, go ahead, Joe.
I was thinking the same thing as Dave. I was just about to, make the same point that you're talking about a spot where your lineup's already filled out, and then so you've got a quarterback, but I mean this is your last pick, so maybe you have a Romo who you think is going to be good, but has some tough games because he plays the whole NFC West. Maybe you don't want to start him at Seattle. Maybe you don't want to start him, week 1 at home against San Francisco, and you can get a Cutler or a Rivers who has a much better matchup in those weeks. I think that's a good play at that point.
Yeah, again, I'm going to disagree because I think that you want to really make a priority to back up certain positions, especially the running back position. We talked about how much injury risk there is with the running back position. I'd much prefer to get a backup there than a backup quarterback that's going to be essentially right at the same level as my other quarterback. It's going to force me into tough decisions every week. There's no reason to have those decisions. You need one quarterback, maybe 2 if you've got an injury-prone guy like RG3, but it's not a position. The whole point of the strategy is that they're all bunched together, so you're not gaining an advantage by taking another one there, in my opinion. But let's move on to another strategy. We already talked about a little bit about handcuffing, and if you're going running back, Joe mentioned it's tough to handcuff all those guys, and handcuffing's a pretty common strategy, but it's not something I really like to do. I mean, well, you look at my strategy and you say, well, yeah, you just have all the handcuffs and none of the starting running backs. But kind of, it's very calculated in the way I select my late round running backs. In that I don't need a guy to have an injury in order to have value. I've mentioned Fred Jackson already. He doesn't need someone to get hurt to have value. You can start him already, and if CJ Spiller gets hurt, then all of a sudden that boosts his value. Darren Sproles, same thing. He has value no matter what. Chris Ivory, I think he's going to have value no matter what on the goal line. So, those are the kind of guys I'm looking at. I think, Dave, you and Joe believe more in handcuffing your running backs, which goes along with your strategy of the quarterbacks and taking a backup there. To me, it's a waste of a roster spot. I want someone that's going to be useful to me and not rely on a guy that needs an injury to happen in order to have value. Because at what point do you give up and say, well, this guy's not going to get hurt? You're going to wait the whole year with a Christian Michael on your bench hoping that Marshawn Lynch gets hurt? I mean, to me, that is not a good strategy, but it is a very common one. So, Joe, kick us off with that. Tell me why handcuffing is the way to go.
Well, I haven't always been a fan of handcuffing, my own guys. I think certain guys, like I think, Nile Davis makes sense if you have Charles. Carey makes sense if you have Forte. There's no one really for Peterson. And Sproles, for McCoy is sort of a standalone guy that you can, that you can roster and potentially use if need be. But I have always been a fan of, if there's a backup sitting out there, even if you don't own the starter, if you have the roster space, if you've built your roster properly, grab somebody like that, like grab maybe a Carlos Hyde or a Christine Michael, roster them as long as you can, and if an injury happens, you've just gained a premier running back. If Frank Gore goes down and you're holding Carlos Hyde, you now have a top 15 running back. I think that's huge. I mean, yes, it's a gamble. There's humongous upsides. I know you're an upside guy. There's, maybe limited potential that it pays off, but how many running backs go down in a given year? I'd say if you believe in the backup running back, that he can step in and produce, I think it's a good idea to handcuff him. Not just anybody. Don't just go out and grab somebody just because they're the backup. You don't need to grab, Grimes if you own Arian Foster. But, assuming Foster does go down, there's going to be a rush to the waiver wire to grab that guy.
Yeah, that's the thing. I like grabbing those guys in the waiver wire, but not necessarily wasting my roster spots on them.
Again, worst to first waivers, I don't get a shot at that.
Yeah, try blind bidding, There's different ways to do waivers, but get in there, Dave. What do you think?
Well, I think it's, there's many factors here. I'm not big necessarily on handcuffs, but the positive that I see of it, if you've drafted 2 elite running backs in the first 2 rounds, these guys are going to play every week for you unless they get hurt, of course, unless they're on a bye. So why do you even need backups? I mean, you talked about you'd rather have some backups to have potential. You talked about the headache when we talked about quarterbacks if you have 2 guys that are the same. What good is it to have a really good backup, a sleeper that's come out of nowhere, if your 2 starting running backs are McCoy and Charles? I mean, you don't need the guy. I mean, you're going to trade him. So it's again, you're not going to have McCoy and Charles on your team. But depending upon how good those running backs are, if you're confident that these guys are going to start for me every single week, then what you would want ideally on your roster, you'd want a 3rd running back that you could play on bye weeks. And then you would want the backups for both of your star players in case one of them got hurt. Because, like I said, you're never going. Doesn't matter who they are. You're never going to play your 4th and 5th running back unless one of your 2 studs gets hurt. I think that to me would be the most, the most logical reason in my mind why you would want to get handcuffs. But like I said, there's many other factors in there. A lot of times you don't know who the backup is,
Absolutely.
And so
Good
right.
point.
And so you force yourself to draft a handcuff guy, and you're guessing between a 2nd and a 3rd string guy where 6 weeks from now, when the injury occurs, it's like, oh, geez, I guessed on the wrong guy. I've been protecting this one guy, wasting my roster spot on this veteran guy, whereas the rookie has developed, and now they put him in there. So there are many negatives to it. I agree. It's one of the reasons that I don't like to do it. But, I do see the big advantage to doing it as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. A lot of times you'll draft a handcuff thinking that he's going to be the guy, and it ends up being someone completely different. Which goes to Joe's point, and there's specific handcuffs that you might want to target in a carry or whoever some of the other big handcuffs that Joe likes are. But that you don't just draft one to draft one. That would be the worst way to go about that strategy. But along those lines, let's go and Dave, you kind of talked about starting two running backs, but you didn't really talk about the possibility of starting three running backs. Your flex position, how do you approach that? Do you look for a running back to throw in there? Is it kind of just whatever falls, however the draft falls for you, or do you target specific positions for your flex?
I think you have to play that by ear. Like I said, I can see a scenario where I would draft running back if the third round comes around and there's just one guy who I think is an elite back that everybody else has missed out on, and I'll draft him and use him at that position. Most likely that's not going to be the case. More likely you're in your draft and your second running back is someone who, oh my God, we're already at the bottom of tier 2. Don't tell me I'm going to have to go to my tier 3 just to get my second running back. So that would be a scenario where if that's the way it played out, I wouldn't have any problem doing that. Same thing with wide receivers. If I, for whatever reason, went out and drafted 3 wide receivers right off the bat, and then I saw, gee, it's round 4 or round 5, whatever it is, and I see why isn't Julian Edelman drafted yet? Oh, I already have 3 wide receivers. Well, so what? He should be a starter. I'll draft him and put him in my flex position even before I get my first or second running back. So I don't go into any draft thinking that my flex this year is going to be a running back or my flex this year is going to be a wide receiver. I will say this, that I do go into the draft thinking my flex will never be a tight end, and that's usually the only other position that you're allowed to play there. So the way I see the draft playing out this year, the way I see myself drafting a team, I'm going to guess that my flex is going to come from the wide receiver position because, like I said before, I think there's just way more depth at wide receiver than there is at running back.
What about you, Joe?
Yeah, I think Dave's right about there's more depth at wide receiver. There's more potential for scoring. I'm like you. I like to run my teams with starting as few running backs as I have to. If you're in a position where you can start 1 running back, do that. If you're in a position to start 2 running backs, that's probably the way to go. If it's 2 in a flex, be sure to get 3 receivers in there. They're probably going to score more. You don't need to roster as many running backs. I think that's the way to go. Dave's right. You're right. You're not going to put a tight end in your flex unless there's a bonus for their receptions or anything like that.
Yeah, as we've talked about in our tight end videos, the position's pretty ugly this year. I think it has a lot of potential to be a good position in a year or two with some of these young guys that could emerge in like the Zach Ertz and Ladarius Greens. But until then, there aren't a lot of great options. So not that you shouldn't ever use a tight end in your flex or anything. Week to week it could change, but you shouldn't ever draft for it, I think, to plan for, okay, well, I'm going to have a tight end as my flex, unless Joe's brought this up before, if you have Gronkowski. If you have Gronkowski, you can take a Jordan Cameron or a Greg Olsen if they slip enough and be comfortable with, number 1, that backs up Gronkowski for if and when he gets hurt, and number 2, he could end up being a good flex play for you depending on where you drafted him. But I'm with you guys. I think wide receiver is the way to go. I will take typically my flex, my 4th wide receiver before my second running back even a lot, so, or sometimes even before my first running back. So I think there's a lot of value in doing that early. Let's go back to...
Sorry, if I could jump in, to what you were saying is, all the roster spots count evenly. So if you're in a spot, if it's the 5th round or whatever, like you were just saying, and you have a wide receiver that you have rated higher than a running back, go ahead and fill your flex position before you fill your second running back, if that's how your draft board shakes out.
No, absolutely. I was going to say let's go back to quarterback because I don't feel like we spent enough time on that. I wanted to cover a different strategy, one we've talked about a little bit, and that's going quarterback early. The opposite of what we talked about just a second ago with the late round quarterback. What do you guys think about taking a quarterback in the first 3 rounds? I know we kind of all agree that taking one of those top 3 quarterbacks or top 4 quarterbacks could present you an advantage. So, Joe, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, I'm huge on Drew Brees this year. I believe he's going third out of, between he, Rodgers, and Manning. I just did a draft where, I went wide receiver. I was drafting at the end of the first round, came back to the end of the third round, and Brees was still there. So I did pick him up near the end of the third round, went on, grabbed another receiver, and got a good tight end, and then started addressing running backs. So I think it's how it works out. If those guys are gone, I would let the draft dictate to me whether or not I'm going to take a quarterback high. But probably around the third round, if those guys are still there, I believe that's the time to consider them.
Yeah, what about you, Dave? You've talked a little bit about Peyton Manning in previous shows and how you'd attack him. You'd consider him with your first round pick, but probably based on his ADP, wait until the second round. But
that to me is one of the biggest uncertainties of the draft this year in my mind. Is that if you, like me, think that Peyton Manning should be drafted in the first round. And I do think he should be one of the first 5 guys selected. But you look at the ADPs, you look at all the material you have available to you, and you see that Peyton Manning is not being drafted in your average draft till 20th. Then you have to ask yourself, well, why am I taking him 5th? When he may not go until the end of the second round? Can I wait until the second round and get him? I think it's a very difficult question to answer. I think the later you draft in round 1, the easier that question becomes, because then even if you decide, I'm going to take a chance, I'm not going to draft him in round 1, you don't have to wait that long for round 2, and then you can get him there. But if you're picking 4th or 5th or somewhere in that range where you've got to wait a long time, basically 20 picks before you pick again, and you're thinking, man, if I don't take Manning now, I'm not going to get him in round 2. I think it becomes a very, very difficult decision for you to make, and just one that it's an individual decision. For me, I would say, you know what, I like Peyton Manning so much that I'm going to take him 5th in this draft, even though I know there's a chance that he could get back to me in round 2. I'm not going to risk it. I'm going to take him. He's going to anchor my team, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, it's a pretty popular saying in fantasy football that you can't really win your draft in your first few rounds, but you can lose it. So when you take a quarterback early, and I'm talking, third round, like Joe, is probably when I first look at a quarterback. I think it's an extremely safe pick. You're going to give yourself a guy with a nice floor that has a ton of potential to put up. Aaron Rodgers, Drew Brees, and Peyton Manning have all put up record-breaking seasons at the quarterback position, and they're liable to do it again. So I think with the popularity of the late-round quarterback, if you've got a bunch of guys in your league that are going to subscribe to that, and they're not even thinking about taking Peyton Manning, they already have in their mind that they're taking an RG3, Colin Kaepernick, Tony Romo later in the draft, all of a sudden you can see these guys slip to the 4th, 5th round. I've seen it. I've seen a Drew Brees go in the 5th round before. And that's where you need to be flexible with your draft plans, not go in with a specific strategy, but be aware of all these strategies we've talked about and be able to be a little bit flexible, because while you might want to go into your draft with the late round quarterback strategy, and I think there's a lot of value in doing that, if all of a sudden you've got Drew Brees in the 4th, 5th round, you've really got to think about pulling the trigger there. So that's kind of how I approach things. I'm very flexible with how I approach my drafts. Of course, with how many I do, I need to do that in order to get the most value out of all the drafts as possible. So
yeah, the site's called Contrarians, right? So if everybody's doing something, there's got to be value in doing the opposite. If you're looking elsewhere, if everyone's making a run on, waiting on quarterbacks, and they're going to let you guys fall to you, or if everybody's grabbing running backs or wide receivers, let that dictate to you. Do the opposite. You'll find value there.
Yeah, there is.
I'm
There's
sorry.
value in being different for sure. Go ahead, Dave.
And I've talked about this on other videos too. That if you draft a quarterback early on, and I would say the same thing for a tight end. If you draft both of those positions early on, or one or the other, you have to realize that at either running back or wide receiver, whichever one you wait the longest on, you're going to be taking a risk there. And the question is, how confident are you that you can draft guys from deep down on one of these lists and still get good quality? That how good a drafter do you think you are? And the way I see the draft working out, I see myself waiting on wide receivers. And the reason for this is I look at the wide receiver list and I see guys with ADPs in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. I mean, guys who I think I know are going to be available late in the draft. And I say, man, I'd love to have that guy as my fourth wideout or my fifth wideout. So I'm confident that by drafting a quarterback early, maybe even drafting a tight end early, I'm still going to have good depth on my team because I can sort among the mess of these lower end wide receivers. If you're not confident in that, or if you're like me and you look at the running back list and say, man, I couldn't do the same thing at running back position. I just don't see fantasy starters anywhere lower than number 20 on the list. Then that would lead me to say, you know what, in that case, I got to get these guys early and I can come back later on and get my tight end and get my quarterback. So that's how confident are you in your own drafting ability, your own rating ability, I think plays a factor in what kind of strategy you should use.
Yeah, and maybe even the drafting ability of your league mates too. I think a more casual league, a bunch of casual football fans that aren't necessarily huge into fantasy football, there might be some value into taking a quarterback early because everyone else is. So if you get one of those top three guys, and everyone else might just take their quarterbacks early because those are always the guys that people know. The casual football fans, the people that don't play a lot of fantasy, they go and they sort by points. They see the quarterback score the most points. I need a good quarterback. So maybe there's value into getting one of yours and then letting all the other quarterbacks go, knowing that your knowledge about the running backs and wide receivers are going to be a lot deeper than those of your opponents. If you're in a league with a bunch of casual fans, you watch people that watch these shows know who the Jordan Matthews are of the world, where they can get some good sleepers a little bit later. Whereas there's not as much value in looking that direction for the quarterback position. So I think that pretty much wraps it up for us. I think we covered a lot of good strategies. I'm curious to hear your guys' last thoughts on strategy in general. And Joe, I will start with you.
Gosh, I think it's kind of been said to death, that you've got to grab your wide receivers. I think that's the way to go. You put a wide receiver in your flex, you get your wide receivers early, come back with running backs later on when you can. And again, with the quarterbacks and the tight ends, it's going to depend on who is there. Near the end of the first round, Jimmy Graham is an option. Gets to the third round, any of those quarterbacks are good options. Around the fifth round, if Jordan Cameron's still there, he's an option. So that's how I'm going to play it is look for receivers early. I'll be very flexible with how I approach quarterback and tight end, and then come back and get running backs later.
What about you, Dave?
I think something you said there, Jeff, a minute ago is very good advice, and that is, what do you know about the people you're drafting against? What do you know about the people in your league? Sometimes you enter leagues on the internet, you have no idea who the competition is, you have nothing really to go on. But a lot of people enter leagues in their office, at their fraternity, at the bar, the same people every year, and you can go back and look at how the draft went last year, and if you see that, wow, 6 quarterbacks went in round 1. And then there was this huge run on running backs, and then the wide receivers went after that. You can tailor your draft strategy around that. So, I think in most drafts that, I've participated in, there's a run on running backs early on. So your question has to be, are you comfortable not participating in that run and getting running back somewhere later in the draft, or do you want to be a sheep? Do you want to be one of these guys who, I got to have 2 of these running backs. I'm going to feel a lot better about my team if I do it. Me personally, I just think I don't like being a sheep, but I just think this is a year where I would say with 80% certainty, I'm going to draft running back with my first 2 picks, get 2 guys who I can count upon, and know that comes round 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, I'm going to make a run on wide receivers, and with hoping that 3 or 4, maybe even 5 of these guys pan out, and I'm confident that'll be the case. So that's going to be my strategy this season.
Yeah, I think we've talked about a lot of really good stuff. For me, I'm going to go very wide receiver early, and it's very aggressive to go with 4 wide receivers with your first 4 picks, but I can't fault you for doing it. I'm doing it myself. So that being said, I will have some flexibility, and if there is a Drew Brees that falls or an Aaron Rodgers that falls to the 4th round, and I'm sitting there, I'm probably going to take them. I'm going to be very flexible with what I'm doing. I like the late round quarterback a lot, but I will take the early quarterbacks when there is value. But you guys need to check out the rest of our videos. We've done quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, broken down each position. We've talked about a couple different strategy things now. Talked about rookies, we've talked about sleepers, bunch of different videos for everyone to check out. They're posted on blog.fanmouth.com and fantasycontrarians.com/videos. So check those out. Thank you, Dave and Join,